The air in the grand atrium of the Sterling Hotel felt different tonight. It wasn't just the cool, conditioned breeze that carried the scent of 1,000 lilies arranged in towering crystal vases. It was a heavier kind of air, thick with unspoken importance and the quiet hum of wealth. Every surface seemed to gleam under the soft, warm light of a chandelier so large it looked like a frozen waterfall of diamonds. The floor was a sea of polished marble that reflected the room back on itself. A dizzying infinity of sparkling gowns and sharp dark tuxedos. This was the annual charity gala for the city's elite. An event where people came to see and be seen, to write checks that were larger than most people's yearly salaries, and to feel, for a few hours, like they were at the very center of the world. Moving through this shimmering crowd was a young woman. Her name was not important to the people here. To them, she was simply part of the scenery, like the marble pillars or the floral arrangements. She was a waitress, and her uniform was a plain black dress that was designed to be forgotten. She carried a silver tray laden with flutes of golden champagne, the tiny bubbles rising in a constant silent race to the surface. Her movements were practiced and economical, a dance she had perfected over many long nights. She knew how to glide through a tight knot of people without a single drop spilling, how to appear at someone's elbow just as they were finishing their drink, how to offer a fresh one with a quiet champagne that was more of a soft breath than a question. Her eyes were constantly moving, but not in the way the guests' eyes were. The guests were scanning the room, assessing, connecting, their gazes sharp and calculating. Her eyes were soft, taking in everything and nothing at once. She saw the flash of a huge diamond on a woman's wrist as she gestured dramatically. She saw the knot of a man's silk tie, perfectly dimpled just below his chin. She heard the tinkling laughter that was meant to draw attention, and the low, serious murmurs of conversations that were meant to exclude. These were the sounds of a world she did not belong to, a world she was only permitted to visit for a few hours at a time to serve its inhabitants. She navigated around a small group of men who were all talking at once, their voices loud and confident. One of them, a man with a face reddened by good food and expensive wine, made a sweeping gesture with his hand, nearly knocking the tray from her grasp. She pulled back with a reflex honed by years of similar close calls, her body twisting in a way that kept the flutes perfectly level. The man didn't even notice her. To him, she was as invisible as the air he breathed. She continued on her path, her expression unchanged. She had learned long ago that showing any reaction, whether it be annoyance or fear, was a waste of energy. It changed nothing. She was a shadow, and shadows did not complain. In the very center of the vast room, like a king on its throne, sat a grand piano. It was a Steinway, black and gleaming, its polished surface reflecting the lights and the colors of the room like a dark mirror. It was a beautiful, imposing object, and yet it seemed strangely alone. Seated on the bench was a man who looked as if he had been poured into his tuxedo. His hair was perfectly styled, not a single strand out of place. His fingers moved over the keys with a clean, efficient precision. The music he played was pleasant, a gentle melody that drifted through the air like the scent of the lilies. It was the kind of music that filled the silence without ever demanding to be truly heard. It was background noise, a soundtrack for the rich to chat and network to as the young woman made her rounds. She found her eyes drawn to the piano again and again. It wasn't the pianist who held her attention. He was just another part of the uniform, like her own black dress. It was the instrument itself. There was something about its stillness, its potential, that called to a part of her she kept carefully hidden. She saw the way the light caught on the curved lid, the elegant line of its legs, the promise held in the 88 black and white keys. It was a language she once understood fluently, a language she hadn't spoken in a very long time. She remembered a different piano, an old upright with chipped keys and a wood frame that was scratched and worn from years of use. It had sat in the corner of a small living room in a small apartment that always smelled of her mother's cooking. She remembered the feel of those keys under her own small fingers, the way they were cool to the touch at first, then warmed by her touch. She remembered the sound that old piano made, not the perfect, sterile sound of this Steinway, but a richer, more human sound, full of quirks and character. It had been her voice, her escape, her best friend. A guest. A woman with a tight, forced smile held up her empty flute and gestured for another. The young woman approached, placed a fresh glass on the woman's table, and picked up the empty one. As she turned to leave, the woman spoke to her friend, not even bothering to lower her voice. "It's simply dreadful what's happening to the arts in this city," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "No one appreciates real culture anymore. It's all so common now." The young woman felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a small, hard knot of resentment. She knew nothing about this woman's life, but she felt certain that the woman's appreciation for culture was just another accessory, like her diamond necklace or her designer handbag. It was something to be displayed, not something to be truly felt. She moved away from the table, the woman's words echoing in her head. She focused on her job, on the simple, physical task of carrying the tray, of weaving through the crowd. She let the rhythm of her work calm her. The weight of the tray a familiar anchor in a sea of strangeness. She passed near the piano again. The pianist was playing a light, airy tune that was as forgettable as the last one. He was good, technically. His fingers were nimble, his timing perfect. But there was no soul in his music. It was empty. It was a beautifully wrapped box with nothing inside. She watched his hands for a moment, the way they moved up and down the keyboard. She felt a strange pang, a mix of sadness and a longing so sharp it was almost a physical pain. She remembered how her own hands used to fly across the keys, not with perfect precision, but with a wild, joyful energy. She didn't just play the notes. She told stories with them. She poured all her hopes, her fears, her anger, and her love into the music. And for a few precious moments, the world would make sense. She had been good. Really good. Her teacher, a kind, elderly man who smelled of mothballs and peppermints, had told her she had a gift. He had seen the fire in her, the way she could lose herself completely in the music. He had dreamed of her playing in grand concert halls, just like this one. But life had other plans. Dreams, she had learned, were a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mother got sick, the medical bills piled up, and the old piano had to be sold. There was no time for lessons, no time for practice. There was only time for work. First one job, then another. The music slowly faded from her life, like a song ending on a distant radio station. Now, her hands were used to carrying trays, to scrubbing floors, to counting out tips at the end of a long night. The calluses on her fingers were from hard work, not from pressing piano strings. The music was a ghost now, a memory that haunted the quiet moments of her life. Sometimes when she was alone in her small apartment, she would find her fingers moving on her lap, tracing the invisible keys of a phantom piano. But the sound was only in her head. A loud burst of laughter from a nearby table broke her reverie. She shook her head slightly, as if to clear it, and focused on the room. The gala was in full swing. The champagne was flowing, the conversations were getting louder, and the pleasant, empty music from the piano continued to drift through the air. She was a ghost in this world, a silent observer. She saw the pretense, the performance, the careful construction of a reality that was as fragile as the crystal glasses in her hand. And in the center of it all sat the piano, a silent, beautiful witness, waiting for someone who truly knew how to speak its language. She felt a strange connection to it, a sense of shared loneliness. It was an object of immense potential, just like her, trapped in a world that only saw its surface. She turned away, her tray held steady, and continued her journey through the glittering, silent crowd. The evening was settling into its comfortable, predictable rhythm. The initial buzz of arrivals had softened into a steady hum of conversation. The young woman continued her silent navigation, her tray a constant extension of her arm. She had learned to anticipate the flow of the room, to see the subtle currents that guided the guests from one cluster to another. She was a study in human behavior, though not in an academic way. It was a survival skill, learned on the job. She knew which guests would want a fresh drink every 10 minutes, which ones would nurse a single glass all night, and which ones were just there for the free food. She moved between these little islands of people, a ferryman on a sea of marble. her presence as unremarkable as the soft music playing in the background. The pianist, the man in the perfect tuxedo, had been playing for what felt like an eternity. His music was a gentle, unobtrusive stream of notes that never once threatened to disturb the delicate balance of the room. It was the perfect soundtrack for a room full of people who were more interested in the sound of their own voices. He played with a detached professionalism, his eyes often looking out over the crowd, but not really seeing anything. He was a clockwork musician, winding himself up and letting himself play until his allotted time was over. As the hour grew late, a small, subtle change occurred in the room's atmosphere. The host of the gala, a man with a politician's smile and a banker's suit, stepped up to a small podium near the grand staircase. He tapped the microphone, and a gentle feedback hum silenced the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "If I could have your attention for just a moment," he went on to thank everyone for coming, to talk about the importance of the charity they were supporting, and to encourage even greater generosity. He spoke of community, of giving back, of making a difference. The young woman stood near the back, her tray now empty, and listened. She had heard speeches like this before. They were full of beautiful words, but they always felt hollow to her. She saw the reality of the city every day, not from the windows of a penthouse apartment, but from the street level. She knew that the problems they were solving with one night of champagne and charity were far more complicated than a speech could ever capture. When the man finished his speech, he led a round of applause and the room's energy shifted. The formal part of the evening was over. This was the signal for the musicians to take a break. The small jazz trio in the corner packed up their instruments, and the pianist at the Steinway gracefully closed the lid over the keys. He gave a polite nod to no one in particular, collected his sheet music, and walked off the stage. Disappearing through a small door behind the curtain, the grand piano was now alone, silent and imposing in the center of the atrium. It looked even bigger and more majestic, without the distraction of the pianist. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a sleeping giant, its potential locked away beneath the polished black lid. The crowd, released from the formality of the speech, became more animated. People moved around more freely, their voices grew louder, and the air crackled with a new kind of energy. The young woman saw this as her cue to get back to work. She knew the next half hour would be busy. She headed to the service bar to refill her tray, her mind already calculating the most efficient route through the now more chaotic room. As she turned away from the bar, her tray loaded with fresh flutes of champagne, she found herself on a direct collision course with a man who was backing away from a conversation, his attention still focused on the person he was talking to. He was a large man, dressed in a suit that strained at the buttons. He was laughing loudly, a booming, self-satisfied sound that filled the space around him. He was completely unaware of his surroundings, a man who was used to the world moving out of his way. The young woman saw him at the last second. She tried to sidestep to pull her tray back, but there was no time. The man backed right into her. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to send her off balance. For a heart-stopping moment, she felt the tray tilt, the weight of the glasses pulling it down. She fought to regain her equilibrium, her body twisting in a desperate attempt to save the drinks. She managed to steady herself, but not before one of the flutes slipped from its rim and fell to the marble floor. It didn't shatter. It was a heavy crystal glass, and it landed with a soft, dull thud, rolling a few feet before coming to a stop near the leg of a table. The sound was insignificant, but in the sudden lull in the nearby conversation, it seemed to echo through the room. The large man turned around, a look of annoyance on his face. He saw the empty glass on the floor, then looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Watch where you're going," he said, his voice gruff and dismissive. He didn't wait for a reply. He just turned his back on her and rejoined his conversation, as if she were a piece of furniture he had accidentally bumped into. A hot flush of embarrassment washed over the young woman. She felt the eyes of a few nearby guests on her, their expressions a mixture of pity and irritation. She was used to being invisible, but being the center of negative attention was a different kind of hell. She bent down to pick up the glass, her cheeks burning. As she reached for it, her hand brushed against the cool, smooth leg of the grand piano, which was standing right beside her. Her fingers, still trembling slightly from the near spill, continued their upward motion, and came to rest on the keyboard. She had forgotten that the pianist had left the lid open. Her fingers, by pure chance, landed on a single key in the middle of the keyboard. The note that rang out was not loud, but it was pure and clear. A perfect C that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. It was a sound so different from the polite background music of the pianist. It was a raw, honest sound, full of a simple, unadorned beauty. For a split second, the entire atrium seemed to hold its breath. Conversations faltered. Heads turned in the direction of the piano. The young woman froze, her hand still on the key, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't meant to do it. It was an accident, a clumsy mistake in a night full of careful, practiced movements. She quickly pulled her hand back as if she had been burned. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She could feel a dozen pairs of eyes on her, and she wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floor and be gone. She had broken the unspoken rules of the room. She, the invisible waitress, had made a sound. She had touched something she wasn't supposed to touch. She braced herself for the inevitable reprimand from the hotel manager, for the condescending glares from the guests, for the humiliation of being publicly shamed. But something strange happened. The reprimand didn't come. The glares were there, but they were mixed with something else. Curiosity. The single note she had played had hung in the air for a moment. Perfect, shimmering sound before fading away. It had been a moment of pure, accidental beauty in a room full of manufactured perfection, and it had changed the atmosphere. The polite, detached hum of the party had been broken, replaced by a more alert, focused silence. The young woman stood up, the empty glass in her hand, her tray still balanced on her other arm. She looked at the piano, then at the crowd, her mind racing. She should apologize. She should explain that it was an accident. She should back away and disappear into the safety of the kitchen. But her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen in the spotlight of 100 pairs of eyes. And in that moment of panic and humiliation, something else stirred inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a flicker of defiance, a spark of the old fire that used to burn so brightly within her. She looked at the piano again. It was no longer just a beautiful piece of furniture. It was an instrument, and it was silent. The pianist was gone. The room was waiting. And she, the invisible waitress, was the only one standing next to it. The note she had played, the accidental C, was still echoing in her mind. It had been a mistake, but it had been her mistake. It was a sound that had come from her touch. And in a world where she was taught to be silent and invisible, that sound felt like the most important thing she had ever done. The silence that followed the single accidental note was heavier than the music had been. It was a thick, expectant silence, filled with the unspoken questions of 100 people. The young woman stood frozen, a statue of a girl in a black uniform, the empty glass in her hand feeling as heavy as a stone. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to apologize, to erase herself from the scene. But her feet were rooted to the spot, pinned in place by the weight of 100 curious stares. She could feel the judgment in their eyes, the annoyance at the interruption, the condescending pity for the clumsy help. She was a spectacle, a momentary disruption in their carefully curated evening. But then something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a movement, but a change inside her. The hot flush of embarrassment began to cool, replaced by a strange, calm resolve. The fear was still there, a fluttering in her chest, but it was now joined by something else. A flicker of defiance. The note she had played, the accidental C, had been a mistake. But it had been a beautiful mistake. It had been a real sound in a room full of echoes. And in that moment, she realized she didn't want to apologize for it. She wanted to hear another one. Her gaze fell from the faces in the crowd and settled on the piano. It was no longer just a beautiful, intimidating object. It was a possibility. It was a voice. And it was silent, waiting. The pianist was gone. The stage was empty, and she was the only one there. The thought that came to her was so wild, so reckless, that it almost made her laugh. It was the kind of thought that belonged to a different person, a younger, more hopeful version of herself, who believed in taking chances. But that version of her was not dead. She had just been buried under years of hard work and disappointment. And now, with a single, clear note, she had just clawed her way out of the ground, slowly. Deliberately, she placed the empty glass on a nearby table. Then, she set her silver tray down beside it. It was a quiet act, but it felt monumental. She was shedding her uniform, not literally, but symbolically. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a person standing in front of a piano. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a new sense of purpose. She turned and walked toward the bench, her steps slow and measured. The crowd watched, their silence now charged with a new kind of energy. They didn't know what was happening, but they knew it was something out of the ordinary. She sat down on the bench. It was a simple wooden bench, but to her, it felt like a throne. The polished wood was cool against her legs, a stark contrast to the heat of the room. She felt a tremor of nervousness run through her, a vibration that started in her feet and traveled up her spine. It had been so long. Her fingers were stiff from carrying trays, not from practicing scales. Her mind was cluttered with orders and table numbers, not with melodies and harmonies. What if she had forgotten how? What if the magic was gone? The fear returned, a cold hand on her shoulder. But she pushed it away. She had come this far. There was no turning back. She placed her hands on the keys. They felt both familiar and foreign. The smooth, cool ivory was a welcome sensation, a connection to a part of herself she had long neglected. Her fingers, usually curled around the stem of a glass or the handle of a tray, felt awkward and out of place. She flexed them, trying to loosen the joints, to bring back the dormant muscle memory. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the room, the people, the expectations. She tried to find that quiet place inside herself, the place where the music used to live. It was dark and dusty in there, but she could feel a faint glow, distant ember waiting to be fanned into a flame. She began to play. The first few notes were hesitant, like a person testing the ice on a frozen lake. It was a simple melody, a soft, questioning phrase that hung in the air. It was not a song the crowd recognized. It was not a jazz standard or a classical piece. It was something else, something personal and raw. It was a sound that was full of space and silence, a stark contrast to the constant pleasant noise of the hired pianist. The notes were not perfect. There was a slight hesitation here, a touch of clumsiness there. But they were honest. They were real. The room was completely silent now. The murmur of conversation had died completely. Even the clinking of glasses and the rustle of dresses had ceased. Everyone was watching the young woman at the piano. The condescending looks had been replaced by expressions of confusion, then curiosity, then dawning realization. They were not just watching a waitress play the piano anymore. They were witnessing something else entirely. They were witnessing a transformation. As she played, the young woman felt the stiffness in her fingers begin to melt away. The music started to flow more freely, the hesitant notes gaining confidence and purpose. The simple melody began to grow, to branch out into more complex harmonies and rhythms. She was no longer just thinking about the notes. She was feeling them. She was remembering. The music was a key. It's unlocking a door to a past she had kept sealed for so long. She remembered the old upright piano in her mother's living room. She could almost feel the worn, slightly rough texture of the keys under her fingers. She could smell the faint scent of wood polish and dust. She could hear the sound of her mother humming in the kitchen while she practiced. The music she was playing now was a variation of a song she used to play, a song her teacher had taught her. It was a song about longing, about a quiet hope for something more. It was a song she had played 1,000 times as a girl, a song that had been her companion through lonely afternoons and difficult nights. As the melody swelled, she poured all of her unspoken feelings into it. She poured in the weariness from her long shifts, the frustration of being invisible, the quiet ache of a dream deferred. She poured in the memory of her mother's smile, the warmth of her teacher's encouragement, the joy she used to feel when the music was her only friend. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a confidant, a vessel for her soul. She was telling a story, her story, without saying a single word. The crowd was captivated. They were drawn into the world she was creating with her music. They could feel the sadness in the minor chords, the flicker of hope in the rising melody. They could hear the story of a life that was very different from their own, a life of struggle and resilience, of quiet dignity and hidden beauty. The woman in the diamond necklace, who had earlier complained about the state of the arts, now had a tear tracing a path down her perfectly powdered cheek. The stern-faced financier, who had been barking orders into his phone, was now leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression one of rapt attention. The young woman at the piano had broken through their defenses, bypassed their intellects, and spoken directly to their hearts. She was no longer a waitress in a black uniform. She was an artist, and in that moment, she was more powerful than anyone else in the room. The music was her power, and she wielded it with a gentle but unyielding force. She was not playing for them. She was playing for herself, for the little girl she used to be, for the mother she had lost, for the teacher who had believed in her. She was playing to reclaim a part of herself that she had thought was gone forever. The melody began to build, notes becoming more urgent, more passionate. Her fingers, now fully awake, danced across the keys with a newfound grace and agility. She was no longer just remembering the music. She was recreating it, infusing it with the wisdom and experience of her lived life. The music was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing thing, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The room was no longer just a room. It was a sanctuary, a sacred space where a group of strangers were united in a shared, profound experience. The invisible waitress had become visible, not by demanding attention, but by offering a piece of her soul. And in doing so, she had touched the souls of everyone who had the privilege to listen. The melody that had begun as a quiet confession now began to grow, stretching its limbs and finding its strength. The hesitant notes were gone, replaced by a voice that was clear and sure. The young woman's fingers, which had felt stiff and foreign just moments before, now moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible. They were no longer the fingers of a waitress, calloused from work and weary from long hours. They were the fingers of a musician, a storyteller, a weaver of spells. The music was no longer just a memory. It was alive, breathing in the grand room. Filling every corner with its sound, the simple melancholic tune began to change. It grew more complex, more layered. New melodies were woven into the original theme, harmonies that were rich and full of emotion. The music was no longer just sad. It was a tapestry of feelings. There was a deep, aching loneliness in the low, resonant bass notes. There was a flicker of defiant hope in the high, bright trills that danced like sparks from a fire. There was a quiet, stubborn strength in the steady, driving rhythm that held it all together. She was not just playing a song anymore. She was painting a picture with sound, a portrait of a life that was full of hardship, but also full of a resilience that refused to be broken. The crowd was completely lost in the world she was creating. The grand atrium, with all its glitter and polish, had faded away. It was no longer a stage for their social performance. It was a concert hall, a cathedral, a sacred space where something real was happening. The guests were no longer a collection of wealthy individuals, each lost in their own world of status and ambition. They were a single, unified audience, bound together by the shared experience of the music. They had come to the gala to be seen, but now they were the ones who were seeing. They were seeing a truth that was more powerful and more beautiful than anything they had expected to find that. Who had been so concerned with the state of real culture, now sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. The tear that had traced a path down her cheek had been joined by others. She was not crying from sadness, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of connection. The music was speaking to a part of her she had long forgotten, a part of her that still remembered what it felt like to dream, to hope, to feel something deeply. She had spent so many years building a wall around herself, a wall of money and status, and carefully constructed indifference. But the music was tearing that wall down brick by brick, note by note. The stern-faced financier, who had spent the evening making deals and asserting his power, now looked like a small boy. His shoulders were slumped, his jaw was slack, and his eyes were fixed on the young woman at the piano. The music was stripping away his armor, his confidence, his carefully cultivated persona. It was forcing him to confront the emptiness that he had been trying to fill with money and success. He was remembering a time when he was young, when he had a passion for something, a dream that he had sacrificed for the life he now led. The music was a mirror, and he did not like the reflection he saw. But he could not look away. Even the large man who had bumped into her, the one who had dismissed her without a second thought, was captivated. He stood near the bar, his drink forgotten in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief. He was trying to process what was happening. This was the waitress, the invisible girl who had almost made him spill his drink. How could she be the one creating this incredible music? It didn't make sense. It challenged his entire worldview, his neat and tidy understanding of how the world worked. People were put in their places for a reason. Some were meant to be served, and some were meant to be served. But this young woman, this waitress, was playing with a power and a passion that surpassed anyone he had ever heard. She was not in her place. She was creating her own. The music continued to build, reaching a crescendo of emotion that was almost unbearable. It was a storm of sound, a torrent of feeling that swept through the room and left no one untouched. The young woman's body swayed with the music, her eyes closed, her head tilted back. She was no longer in the grand atrium of the Sterling Hotel. She was back in that small living room playing for her mother. She was in that dusty practice room, listening to her teacher's gentle guidance. She was on a stage, in a concert hall, in a world where her music was her voice and her soul. She was playing for all the times she had been silent, for all the dreams she had buried, for all the parts of herself she had lost along the way. And then, suddenly as it had begun, the storm subsided. The music softened, the complex melodies falling away until only the original simple theme was left. It was a quiet, haunting melody, full of a gentle, lingering sadness. It was a farewell, a final whispered thought before the silence returned. She played the last few notes with a delicate touch, each one a soft, clear bell in the stillness of the room. And then her fingers lifted from the keys, and the music was gone. The silence that followed was different from the one that had come before. It was not a heavy, expectant silence. It was a deep, reverent silence, a sacred space where the echoes of the music still lingered. No one moved. No one spoke. They were all still under the spell of the young woman and her piano. They were all trying to process what they had just experienced. To make sense of the profound emotions that had been stirred up within them, the young woman sat at the piano, her hands resting in her lap. Her breathing was heavy, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the performance. She slowly opened her eyes, as if waking from a long, deep sleep. She looked out at the room, at the rows of faces that were turned toward her. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was, or what had just happened. She saw the tears, the awe, the disbelief in their eyes, and she realized with a sudden jolt of clarity what she had done. She had not just played the piano, she had bared her soul. She had shared a piece of herself that she had kept hidden for so long, and in doing so, she had touched the souls of everyone in the room. The spell was broken by a single sound. It was a sniffle, a small, choked sob from the back of the room. It was followed by another, and then another. The silence was being replaced by the sound of people being moved, of people feeling something real. Then a man stood up. He was an older man, with a kind face and a shock of white hair. He had been a patron of the arts for many years, and he had heard some of the best musicians in the world. But he had never heard anything like this. He began to clap. It was not a polite, perfunctory clap. It was a slow, deliberate, heartfelt clap, a sound of deep and genuine appreciation. His actions were a signal. As if on cue, the rest of the room rose to their feet. The applause started as a ripple, then grew into a wave, a thunderous roar that shook the chandeliers. It was a standing ovation, not for a hired musician, not for a famous celebrity, but for a young woman in a black uniform, a waitress who had touched a piano and changed everything. The sound was overwhelming, a wall of sound that washed over her, a validation of everything she had ever felt, everything she had ever dreamed of. The young woman sat on the bench, stunned. She had never experienced anything like this. She had played for her mother, for her teacher, for herself, but she had never played for a crowd like this. She had never received this kind of response. She felt a wave of emotion so powerful that it almost knocked her over. It was a mixture of shock, gratitude, and a profound, life-altering joy. She had spent so many years feeling invisible, feeling like she didn't matter. But in this moment, she was the most visible person in the room. She was the center of their attention, not because of a mistake, but because of her talent, her passion, her truth. The manager of the hotel, a man who had always treated her with a polite but distant indifference, now rushed to her side. His face was a mixture of shock and excitement, his eyes wide with the possibilities. He had just witnessed a miracle, a transformation that he could never have imagined. He saw not just a talented waitress, but a potential star, a jewel that had been hiding in plain sight. He knew that this was a moment that could change everything for his hotel, for his career, and for the young woman who was still sitting at the piano, bathed in the light of 1,000 cameras that were not there, but whose flashes she could feel in her soul. The applause continued, a deafening, glorious sound that was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter that she had never dared to imagine. The sound was a physical force, a warm wave that washed over her, threatening to pull her under. It was the roar of 100 people on their feet, a thunderous, cascading applause that filled the vast atrium and seemed to shake the very foundations of the Sterling Hotel. The young woman sat frozen on the piano bench, her hands trembling in her lap. The world had narrowed to this single, overwhelming moment. The lights were too bright, the sounds too loud, the emotions too raw. She felt exposed, as if she had stepped out of her skin and left it for all to see. The music had been a shield, a private language she had spoken to herself. But the applause was the response, the public acknowledgement that what she had done was not just for her. It was for them too. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but the faces were a blur of light and shadow. She saw the glint of diamonds, the white of shirts, the movement of hands clapping in unison. It was a sea of people, and she was the small island they were all focused on. The manager of the hotel was at her side now, his face a mask of ecstatic disbelief. He was saying something to her, his voice a low, urgent murmur that she couldn't quite decipher over the din. He was gesturing, his hands moving with a frantic energy. He was probably telling her to stand up, to take a bow, to accept the adoration of the crowd. But she couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, her feet glued to the floor. Then, a single voice cut through the noise. It was the voice of the older man with the kind face, the one who had started the ovation. "Brava," he shouted, his voice clear and strong. "Brava." The word was like a key, unlocking the paralysis that had held her captive. She slowly, carefully, pushed herself up from the bench. Her legs were shaky, and she felt a wave of dizziness, but she managed to stand. She turned to face the audience, her hands clasped in front of her, her head bowed. She didn't know what to do. She had never taken a bow before. She had never been in a position where a bow was expected of her. She gave a small, awkward nod, a gesture of gratitude that felt inadequate, but it was all she could manage. The applause swelled even louder, a deafening roar of approval. The manager gently took her by the arm, guiding her away from the piano. She stumbled slightly, her legs still unsteady, and he supported her, his touch a strange mix of professional courtesy and personal excitement. He led her through the parting crowd, the guests turning to watch her as she passed, their faces now clear and sharp. They were not looking at her with pity or condescension anymore. They were looking at her with awe, with respect, with a newfound understanding. They were seeing her, not as a waitress, but as the artist who had just moved them to tears. As she walked, she caught snippets of conversation. "Incredible," a woman whispered to her friend. "Where did she come from?" "I've never heard anything like it," a man said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She has a gift, a real gift." The words were a balm to her soul, a validation of the long, lonely years she had spent nurturing her talent in secret. She had always known that the music was special, that it was a part of her that was true and pure. But she had never allowed herself to believe that it could mean anything to anyone else. She had always told herself that it was just a hobby, a private indulgence, a dream that was too fragile to survive in the harsh light of reality. But now, the dream was real. The music had escaped the confines of her small apartment and had found a home in the hearts of 100 strangers. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. She was no longer in control. The music had a life of its own. It was taking her on a journey she had never planned to take. The manager led her to a quiet office behind the main reception desk. He closed the door, and the sound of the applause was instantly muffled, a distant, comforting roar. The office was small and cluttered, a stark contrast to the pristine elegance of the atrium. There was a desk piled high with papers, a few mismatched chairs, and a small window that looked out onto the street. It was a real room, a working room, a place where things got done. And for the first time that night, she felt like she could breathe. The manager offered her a glass of water, his hand still trembling slightly. That was something else, he said, his voice full of a genuine, unguarded admiration. I've been in this business for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Who are you? Where did you learn to play like that? She took a sip of the water, the cool liquid a welcome relief to her dry throat. She didn't know how to answer his question. Who was she? She was a waitress, a daughter, a dreamer. She was a girl who had sold her piano to pay for her mother's medical bills. She was a woman who had buried her dreams under a mountain of responsibilities. But she was also the girl who had just played her heart out on a grand piano in a room full of strangers. She was all of those things, and none of them. I used to play, she said, her voice quiet and hesitant. It's been a long time. The manager leaned forward, his eyes intense. A long time? It doesn't show. You have a natural talent, a gift that can't be taught. People would pay a lot of money to hear you play like that. She shook her head, a wave of disbelief washing over her. No, they wouldn't. It was just a fluke, a moment of madness. I don't even know what came over me. It wasn't a fluke, the manager said, his voice firm. It was destiny, and I'm not going to let it slip away. I want to offer you a job. She looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion. A job? I already have a job, not as a waitress, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. As a musician, I want you to be the house pianist at the Sterling Hotel. We'll get you a proper piano, a real one, not just that old Steinway. We'll create a special evening for you, a piano night or something. We'll market it, we'll promote it, we'll make you a star. Oh. The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. A job as a musician. It was the dream she had dared to dream, the one she had buried so deep she thought it was dead. And now it was being offered to her on a silver platter. A gift from a man who had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time. She felt a surge of emotion, a mix of joy, fear, and a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She wanted to say yes, to shout it from the rooftops, to grab this opportunity with both hands and never let go. But a part of her hesitated. A part of her was still the waitress, the invisible girl who was used to being disappointed. A part of her was afraid that this was all a dream, that she would wake up in her small apartment, the echoes of the music fading in her mind, and find that nothing had changed. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Say yes, the manager said, his voice gentle but firm. Say yes to your dream. Say yes to the music. She looked at him, at the hope and excitement in his eyes. She thought of the old upright piano in her mother's living room, of the hours she had spent practicing, of the joy she had felt when the music was her only friend. She thought of the silence that had followed her mother's death, the long, empty years when the music had been a distant memory. She thought of the single, accidental note she had played on the Steinway, the note that had changed everything, and she knew what she had to do. She had to take a chance. She had to believe in the magic of the music, and in the magic of herself. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. Yes, I'll do it. The manager's smile widened, and he reached across the desk and shook her hand. You won't regret it, he said. I promise. As she left the office and walked back into the atrium, the applause had died down, and the crowd was starting to disperse. But as she passed, People still turned to look at her, their faces filled with a newfound respect. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the pianist, the artist, the woman who had touched their hearts with her music. She walked with a new confidence, a new sense of purpose. She was still the same person, but everything had changed. She went back to the piano, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool keys. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the long, winding road of hardship and hope. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, that the road would not always be easy. But she also knew that she had the music, and that was all that mattered. She had found her voice, and she was ready to share it with the world. And as she sat down on the bench and began to play, the first notes of a new song, a song of hope and new beginnings, filled the grand atrium of the Sterling Hotel, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit.